And I can send you my notes.
That'd be wonderful. Thanks so much. All right. Hi, Aneta. So for those that don't know, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your areas of interest, things of that nature, and what's kind of brought you towards this project?
Absolutely. I think it's really important also so that I explain when I talk about productions and experiences I've had, what is the basis of my discussion and what is the context. So I'm a lecturer at Royal Holloway, lecturer in theatre. And I've worked a lot with companies that experiment with technology. And first I worked with a company in Poland called Video Theatre, and I worked with them since 2009. They're a company that started exploring with video on stage. So they recorded video, presented live video back in like 1985. So obviously I didn't start working with them, as I said, in 1985, but 2009, and we've worked really closely. And I saw their process, and I've been really part of their process. And then since 2012, I've worked with a company based in Brussels called Crew. And they are a company that has been kind of operating since 1991. They were started by Eric Joris, their artistic director, and they explore the cutting edge technologies in terms of augmented reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence in performance, very sophisticated motion capture systems. And then in 2020, I worked with Nexus Studios, which is a design, animation and video studio based in London, London, Los Angeles, and Sydney. So they are a global company. They work with really big partners like Google and Samsung. So I've had a lot of collaborations with companies and in industry, and I really enjoyed that. And I think that gives me a bit of an insight into how adaptations of Shakespeare are being made. What is interesting, all those three companies that I've worked with, the work started with them because they were interested in exploring adaptations of Shakespeare, and that's how we hit it off. And not all the projects we were involved with had to do with Shakespeare, but there was often a common interest and often the starting point of our collaboration. And I myself.
Yeah, no, go. Yeah, yes. Yeah, I was just saying that's all great. Thank you so much. Tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, this is important. Yeah, and I myself work research on Shakespeare and digital media, and particularly since 2009, I've been kind of focusing on how technology is integrated into productions of Shakespeare. So I published a book with Paul Grave called Intermedial Shakespeares on European Stages in 2014. There's my new book coming out this year called Shakespeare After Deconstruction, which has a chapter on mixed reality Shakespeare production we did with Crew. And I'm also commissioned to do a book for Cambridge University Press called Mixed Reality Shakespeare, which hopefully I'm writing and publishing this year. And I'm interested particularly in projects that look at the process of making theater, at the ways in which Shakespeare acquires new meanings, in which projects in which technology is meaningfully integrated into performance of Shakespeare. I'm always interested in questions: why Shakespeare? What kind of Shakespeare is meant in those productions, and how technology affords new kinds of experiences and modes of perception for the audience. And that's why I'm really excited about your project. It's absolutely fascinating. I love how it's both, live and digital, how you think about accessibility, how you're thinking about inclusivity in this project, audience access from the very beginning. I think it's wonderful. And I love the location, which is very symbolical as well, and how you've established amazing partnerships. So I'm really looking forward to working with you guys on this and being of help. And as I said, I'm very happy to support in terms of thinking through some audience questions, audience surveys, also post production, and any kind of support also in terms of research and historical research that you might need. I'm very happy.
Amazing. No, that sounds so good, mate. It sounds so good. That's a really great introduction to your background and what's kind of drawn you to the project. I think that's a good jumping off point for us to go into some of our kind of key questions, I suppose. And as we've said, digressions are welcome and encouraged, so we don't need to stick rigidly to this plan. But I suppose really the first place to start with the background that you've had, the previous collaborations that you've had, what are the things that audiences have responded to both most positively and most negatively to in theatre that is integrating creative technologies? I guess, and Shakespeare that's integrating creative technologies.
Yeah. So I can speak on the basis of experience I had explicit, especially with Crew, when we did an adaptation of, well, series of adaptations of Hamlet, but we did specific audience feedback following VR immersions. So this is, I think it's also important when you say creative technologies to also, think about what each of them require from the audiences and challenges they have. I think, it's kind of important to fine tune it. And I think I had this wonderful privilege of working on a VR adaptation with Crew, and we got very extensive audience feedback from that. What is interesting, we got audience feedback from people who are theater scholars, because we presented the installation, the immersion at conferences in theater and Shakespeare studies. So people who were experiencing it were quite, not always people in VR world, people in technology world or theater world. They were sometimes very historically oriented Shakespeare scholars, but they had some interest in either Shakespeare or theater. And so they gave us really fine-tuned feedback. And then I was working with Nexus on this AR application of The Tempest, and we got quite limited. We only had 6 responses, unfortunately, because of access, which I can talk about later. But this was very insightful, and people who gave us feedback were also quite in the know, because they were all the people who attend theater, who almost all of them had experience with AR before. So I think they were quite distinct in the responses, and I think it's also important to say who were our pool of participants in those performances. And I think there's also something to bear in mind in terms of, thinking about inclusivity, right? Who do you want to include? Because I think you were very keen to widen up your audience, and I think I kind of have, certain observations about what can go wrong with what has to be done for this to happen. So in terms of the most positive feedback in both, the Crew's VR immersion installation and in Nexus's app experience, we noticed that people really craved some form of agency. In interactivity, people want to be able to participate, and I wonder if it's the nature of the medium, because it just, otherwise it just might not feel live. It's important for them to distinguish this medium from, let's say, cinema or even, give it a distinctive aspect of gaming experience to make it more social, more participatory. So people did want to have agency. They wanted to be able to influence the digital environment, and they wanted to be acknowledged, and they wanted to have a sense of sociability. So I would say agency, interactivity, acknowledgement, and sociability are 4 key aspects.
Nice.
And in terms of VR and AR, it's slightly varied, because I feel like with AR, people wanted this interactivity even more than people in VR. And people in VR felt like they wanted to be acknowledged. They wanted to be spoken to. They wanted to be able to, like, feel that there is some presence, that they're present and that the actors are present. I think, I'm thinking about this, very basic, like just wanted to be cared for and loved. And I think in a way, VR can enable that if you have it as a one-to-one, if somebody introduces you to this experience, leads you on this journey and then leads you out of this journey. It can be very, very kind of nice. And this transition from the live to the virtual world can be an important moment. And then what happens within and who's going to guide you. They just didn't want to be alone wandering around the space. They didn't want to be invisible. I mean, they kind of like being visible, but they also wanted to have moments when they feel like the actors know that they're there. With AR, it felt to me that people particularly wanted to be able to influence the world that they were experiencing. So that I think it boils down to the idea of also liveness, that they kind of wanted the experience to feel live, and they wanted to feel like this is happening now, and I'm in it. And I feel like the experience of liveness is very close to the experience of presence, like they want to be present. And in AR, they really wanted to be able to activate certain things and see that they are present, but also see that other people are present with them. So see how other people are activating certain elements of the digital environment. And so in the Nexus Tempest, we had a possibility for the audience to activate clouds or plant seeds, and shrubs were growing out of them. But people didn't feel like it was necessarily a sign of the performance being live. They wanted, human interaction. They wanted to also maybe feel that other people are planting the seeds, that there is. And I think maybe what also brings these 2 experiences together, that people didn't want to be lonely. They didn't want to be in this void of the digital. And they wanted to be, acknowledged that, that they're there. So I think that's what was the kind of the positive things. And so either we, if we were able to do that, people were, enjoy that. If they felt like they were not acknowledged, or they were lonely, or they were left alone to their devices, they felt abandoned, and they didn't feel like it was a social theatrical experience. So these were the positive kind of the positive things. So yeah, so as I said, in what people responded to most positively, so it was the possibility of interacting, making an impact on the digital world, being able in VR to come very close to the actors as well. I think that can create incredible moments of intimacy, but then also some of them felt that they felt like they were being, spying on the actors, and that they were not necessarily, especially if we were using omnidirectional video, so 360 video, they felt like they were a bit of intruders. With avatars, they felt that, because there was not such maybe human likeness, that was fine. So it's also like, because with Crew, what was very interesting, we had an experience which was layered. So audiences could swap between two parallel virtual worlds. So there was either a 360-degree video of the studio where the performance was being recorded with motion capture, or there were avatars in the ruins of the castle, and they could move between those two. And it just felt to them, when they were in the 360-degree video and they were not being acknowledged, that there was something odd about this. Whereas with the avatars and the kind of magical space, they felt a bit more comfortable. And this was the space that was not very realistic. It was dilapidated and dreamy. And I think what audiences enjoyed was this character, was the idea of it being very out of this world, because when you're in this world, but you're not like acknowledged and you don't know what's going on, that I think can be a bit disorientating. So yes, so in terms of negative feedback of the audience, I think particularly when you're looking at VR and AR, people don't like not to know what is expected from them, not knowing how to operate the devices, not knowing what they can do or should do. And I think this also holds for immersive performances, in like physical immersive performances. I mean, I've been to Punch Drunk, and there are very interesting parallels, by the way. I mean, I've been to some Punch Drunk performances where I just felt
please, could you develop on that explicitly?
Yeah.
Because that will be especially relevant to what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's quite telling that, Punch Drunk is a company that also is now getting into VR, because I think we, with the same questions of being acknowledged, the interactivity and the agency, which I think I'm encountering in those projects that I'm working on, are the issues I've encountered as an audience member while attending Punch Drunk performances, where it just feels like it can be about exploration of the space, and it's about knowing also what are the rules of the game. And particularly when I went to see Sleep No More, their Macbeth adaptation in New York City, I just felt like I was just, in a museum almost, exploring the space, but not knowing what's going on. And similarly in digital space, and perhaps even more, because you just don't know, you might feel like, oh, there's maybe a button I should push, or maybe some other door I could open. And I'm not, and is this all, and how am I supposed to operate in this space? So it can lead to people feeling disoriented and left alone. And I think it's important to also, because immersive performances have been around for such a long time now, and they became kind of staple of British theatre at the moment. I mean, I think they're fading away a little bit to some extent, but there was a big fashion for them. I think 5-10 years ago, they were the whole, they were hype. I mean, and the Punch Drunk is still doing very well. I know their recent show is, they're showing in, I think March, April, something is selling, is sold out, like most of the tickets. But I think, that, it's kind of this experience of being in the space, being with others. And I think we're craving for it even more now, given the pandemic. But I think it's important. This is an experience where you feel like you are really with other people and you know what's going on. So coming back to the negative aspects, yes, not knowing what is expected from you, especially if it's a device, like headset or, an app you're not familiar with, you were just asked to download. How do you operate that? What are your options? So it should be quite simple, I think. And this is also something I'm going to talk about later. With Shakespeare specifically, there is a problem when there is too much text. And there is visual input, because, as we know in VR, the experience of being in virtual space can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're doing it for the first time. your whole body is assaulted from all sorts of, you know, sides. You're just trying to negotiate corporality, you know, where am I? How can I move in the space? You know, things can move very quickly. You don't know, you know, who are the other people and who are you, and your corporality, locality is very much in the flux. So if you add to this very complex language, people can be a bit lost, especially if they are not, you know, necessarily Shakespeare specialists who know it by heart, and they just kind of, and especially if you want them to follow a story from the language. So when I went to see Current Rises, which was a VR opera at Royal Opera House, which was also done in collaboration with Royal Holloway, I found that there was a beautiful combination of music and music can be nice, and music and words. And that in a way, you know, the words were important, but they were kind of more poetic, and they were used, you know, within the production as also as visual material. So I think it's also important to think about what is the role of the text, what is the role of the language in this, and whether you want to incorporate it within the digital world, whether, you know, people might activate certain words, whether and certainly it's important not to overwhelm people with language and with too much words. I remember when we did our Shakespeare presentation in Shakespeare immersion of the crew, like with crew, some even like Shakespeare scholars were saying this can be quite disorientating, because, you know, you're already trying to find out what you're doing in VR, and then having the language kind of adds a really like a big layer. So then we were trying to strip down the language and also have a figure of the guide. I think that's also something I want to.
A guide, yes, awesome.
Guide, yeah.
Let's put a pin in the guide, because I really want to delve deeper into that. But for now,
yes, I've got guide figure. I've got guide figure. Mark, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so because in our production, we're not looking at using headsets, virtual worlds. It's going to be very much kind of immersive technologies that don't require intermediary media. So like anything that's going to take you out, because we've all got this incredible space, we want to use it. So back to one of those companies that you mentioned, the video theatre in Poland, how they're using projection image, things of that nature. Are there any parallels that you can draw from that experience in terms of how that was integrated well, or how it could be integrated well, knowing now what we know?
Yeah, so just kind of let me, maybe before I just go to video theater, let me just very quickly say like 2 other lines about negative experiences.
Oh, please, go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
So the first, like not knowing what is expected from you and how to operate things when it's too much text and there is too much visual input. So, I mean, even if you're doing an immersive in space and you've got, you know, people just trying to, oh, you know, this is an interesting space. How can I, you know, play with that? Where can I go? Oh, let me see this. Oh, this is nice. Oh, you know, then they might not be hearing what's going on because their other senses are being occupied. And then, you know, if you were using technology, understanding how technology is part of the narrative and enhances the action. People, I think, are really sensitive to that. They notice if this is just a gimmick, and I think it really rubs them the wrong way. So going to video theater, this is a really interesting company, which is incredibly avant-garde and cutting edge in the Polish theater scene. And I think I've been drawn to them because they really explore questions of time and space, and the idea of the past, and the idea that in theater we can complicate the experience of the place and the space for the audience in extraordinary ways. So they were using these video projections. As I said, they started using them like back in 1985. And this is a very small company. So there is a theater director who is also a poet and a dramaturg and a playwright. And he presented himself on stage as a VJ early on. So he would operate the technology in real time. So we could see him being there. We could see what he was doing. We could not always understand what was going on. We could not always understand all the effects that, you know, especially the illusions he was creating, but we could see that, you know, how technology was being operated. And they had lots of initially like TV screens. And then there would be more kind of like flat screens. And he would be operate different recordings, videos from that. Often the performances would begin with a recording of the audience coming into the space. And sometimes he would overlap it with images of other audience members from other performances. So we wouldn't be sure, like, you know, am I being recorded? Is like somebody else, like, you know, this performance like from today, from last week, from, you know, a year ago. And then within the performance, he would be often playing with those effects of unsettling our perception of space or time, like we would be sometimes thinking that we are in one, like that this is happening now, but in fact was pre-recorded. So he would very nicely, create these illusions of what is recorded, what's been pre-recorded. And there would be also dialogues with, what's pre-recorded. And in terms of space, he would just take us different places where we would otherwise not be able to go to, because their stage is very small. They have like, I think 60 audience members only in the auditorium. So, and this is a very small space, even though they have a whole building, it's a nice building, but they didn't have like huge stage and huge audience, huge auditorium, but they would really open it up. And they would open it up to, like, they would take you to ancient Greece and other cities in Poland. And it was often thematically linked to plays he was presenting, which were often about explorations of the past and death. And also how technology is a mask for death, how it's, how that idea of a mask and death goes back to the idea of Greek theater. It was also very, very kind of poetic and multi-layered. And he used the concepts from archaeology to think about how you're excavating the past, how you're always presenting different layers, but make these layers visible to the audience. And also the idea of palimpsest was really important, so that you would see, the things that were written under. So I've really enjoyed the work of this company. I wrote an article about their Hamlet, which I can also share.
That'd be awesome. Yes, please do. That'd be great. Fabulous. Yeah. All right, nice. Shall we jump back briefly to the guide then?
Yes. So I put the guide with exclamation mark when you ask, how do we help set the audience expectations and behaviors? I think from my experience of working with, on different projects, and also my experience as an audience member, I think it's really nice if you're in a completely new environment, especially like immersive performance, you need to have a guide, someone who introduces it, who kind of accompanies you, who explains what's going on, who sets up the expectations, and you kind of feel acknowledged, you feel you're looked after, and I think the guide is absolutely fundamental. And I've noticed that, for instance, the RSC Dream, they had a guide which I think was packed, and I think was really effective. With crew, we at some point we just discovered, okay, we need to, Hamlet will be our guide, and an actor who was playing Hamlet took over this role. And I think, when I, for instance, watched Sleep No More, I didn't feel like there was necessarily one figure of the guide, and I didn't know what am I supposed to be doing. I couldn't follow the actors because I didn't know, and I felt like I would have to make a lot of effort to follow them. I mean, also, I think it's another thing to think about is that people might be lazy, you don't want them to be necessarily running after the actors or being incredibly inventive. You just want them to also enjoy this, they might be coming after a busy day of work, they might have other things going on in their minds. Yeah.
So just on that note, I think there's a really interesting tension there, and I think it's being repeated over and over again in different touch points. So one, you said audiences like the idea of having agency, but too much agency is as bad as none at all. So there's got to be a balance there. Similarly, absolutely, when we're working with the technologies and the visual environment is overwhelming, again, it's too much. And so it seems like there are points of tension between these ideas of freedom and caretaking, if we call it that. And so I guess I'm just interested in maybe good examples of, because obviously the show that we're intending to create is linear, it's on the rails, so it's not a punch drunk thing where there's vignettes happening everywhere and you just go around and look at them in your own time. One thing happens after another, and it is very heavily text based currently. Like we're really trying to preserve as much of the text as possible, and also
why do you preserve as much of the text? And this is an interesting question. Maybe why
do you preserve because I think it comes from what I'm calling original parallels, essentially. So not original practice, which is striving for authenticity, but trying to replicate the conditions of Elizabethan theatre in new contexts. So for instance, soliloquies are going to be a conversation with the audience. So the things that people want to feel present, to feel acknowledged, to feel like other people are also present. All of that can happen really simply if Macbeth says, if it were done when 'tis done, 'twere it were done quickly, right? And the audience feels like they're being spoken to, feels like he's having this debate with them rather than with himself, and they're kind of looking in. So I think the text has lots to offer in terms of unlocking some of the principles that people, some of the things that people want from these experiences. And I think it strikes the balance quite well of caretaking, but also allowing for some interaction, or certainly that's what we're trying to go with the show. So one of the big questions that we're asking as well is about audience complicity. So the murder of Duncan in this version is a mutiny. How do we get the audience to endorse that? Is like one of the questions, that the dramaturgical questions that we're asking. And that comes from the idea that scene between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, where he's like, if it were done when 'tis done, oh, you know what, I'm not going to do it. And then Lady Macbeth comes in and goes, you coward, you've got to do it. And then they have this argument. That argument is going to be triangulated through and with the audience. So Lady Macbeth is not just talking to Macbeth. And that's something that I think is already there in Shakespeare. There's a difference between who you're speaking to and who you're speaking for. And I think that the court of public opinion actually sways a lot in Shakespearean plays, and the audience is meant to have an opinion on what's going on in the story. So the question is how we can set up a game, as you said, the rules of the game, the simple rules of the game, where if you disagree with the argument the character is making, you can productively give voice to that in a way that activates the actor to make the next point they have and the next point they have, rather than heckling, which is just like, you're shit. But if someone goes, if it were done when it was done, then to well, it was done quickly, someone go, oh, yeah, kill him. And that can motivate him to go into his next thought. Or if someone says, no, don't kill him, then they can go, well, yeah, I mean, if this assassination could trammel up the consequence and capture this success, this blow would be the be all and the end all here, right? So he can make he can articulate his argument in response to what he's getting from the audience. So that's an example of how I suppose we are looking at integrating the audience having freedom of opinion, if not necessarily freedom of action all the time. And then there'll be other moments where hopefully we can give them some freedom of action as well. But those are just, I guess, some top line ideas that we're exploring. But for that reason, we're giving the audience a different experience of the text than they've had in a conventional theatrical experience. And I think that's something that I'm excited to do, because I feel like Shakespeare in British theatre in particular is not done well, because it doesn't acknowledge the role of the audience. And so I guess that's what we're trying to kind of grind it in. But in order to do that, you have to use the text. We're still going to cut it. We're not going to use the entire uncut thing. But nevertheless, Shakespeare is argument. The argument is made through the language. So you've got to keep the language if you're going to have the argument.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, because, you know, it's very interesting when you say the British, because my first thought it was, okay, Europe versus UK in coming to Shakespeare, because there's a very different approach to the text in the UK Shakespeare versus continental Shakespeare. First of all, in non-British production, and I've worked a lot. I mean, you notice, I mean, I worked with a Polish company. I worked with Crew, which is a Brussels-based company. I also worked, and I attended rehearsals of another company, which I maybe could mention now. It's a company based in Italy called Compagnia della Fortezza. And they are a company that works in a high security prison in Tuscany. And their work is very interesting, and especially for your project, because they work a lot with activating, you know, the audience, making the audience think, using the space, creating immersive, you know, experiences. And I participate in some of the rehearsals, and all the work is done with inmates of this high security prison, because they've been there they are sentenced for long, you know, it's a high security prison. They've been sentenced for like, you know, 15, 20 years often. They have a lot of time to really, you know, get to grips with acting and the text, and they have rehearsals every day, all day. Some of them, one of them, I forgot his name, Arena, I think was his last name. He became quite a renowned actor, and they kind of get, you know, they establish their craft. So what I noticed in non-continental approaches to Shakespeare is that text is just a springboard. So first of all, as I said, you work on translations, so it's a modernized version. Often translations are being made by the dramaturg, who is collaborating alongside the director for a long time. So for instance, Jens Roselt does a lot of translations for Pucher, Stefan Pucher. So this is someone who is even like working, with someone and kind of with a translator who is also a dramaturg, who is working with the director, who is saying, okay, what is the focus here? And then producing a translation. So it's kind of like a new text almost. Then there is a lot of other texts that are being used. So for instance, Punzo, when he was doing his adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, which is called Mercutio non vuole morire, Mercutio doesn't want to die, he used a lot of a lot of contemporary Neapolitan playwrights, all sorts of texts. So it was like a collage of texts. And I think, and I don't know if you're open to that, because I know it's like the text is, and people expect, a lot of there'll be this line and people will be like, okay, where is this line? Because it's a different audience, right? In the UK, people will be coming to see the Tempest.
I think there's a slight bridging effect of the audience being majority first language English speakers. And the fact that it's embedded in the education system, which means I think people have a bigger toolkit for interpreting Shakespeare as a listener. I think they're more readily capable of doing that without that kind of interpolation. That said, we are putting adaptations in order to make it fit the context. And also we're adding in, so Middleton obviously famously kind of extrapolated on Macbeth and added additional scenes and stuff like that. So we're taking our kind of inspiration from that. So we've cut Middleton's interpolations, but we are adding things from the golden age of piracy that fit with the themes of the play, but also ask people to examine the kind of questions that we're trying to examine at the same time.
And
but
I think that's
the thing about that is that is 1720s, so it's 100 years after. And the grammatical way in which the text sounds and hits the ear sounds essentially like Shakespearean prose. So it fits very neatly into the sound world of the original text. So that's the kind of approach we're taking. It's not something we're not looking to modernize, because I don't think in our context we need to. But I do think that nowhere near enough work is done in most productions of Shakespeare on making the text clear and understandable to the audience. I think actors internalize intention and internalize meaning, and they don't actually externalize that and help the audience understand. So again, by trying to make this about the arguments being made to the audience, the character has an imperative to be understood then, rather than just like, oh, I'm expressing my thoughts and feelings for my own benefit.
And I think it's fundamental. So and I agree, and I fully understand it's a completely different audience. People just want certain lines to be there, and but at the same time, it's, as you say, it's about the actors really owning the lines. I worked quite a bit with Barbara Hausmann, who is a voice coach. She worked a little, quite a bit on Shakespeare. She had, advice on quite, high profile, like Don Mar and other places, National and so on. Some of her clients are, like really important people. Anyway, so she always said how you have to own the text and really understand what you're saying. And we talked about a production of King Lear, which was at Old Vic with Glenda Jackson. I don't know if you saw it. And it felt like when I went to see it, I felt incredibly bored, and I felt like many of the actors, especially Goneril, I think also Cordelia, they were just, I don't know, they just felt like they didn't understand what they were saying. And I remember I talked about this to Barbara at the time, and she said, I listened to the BBC radio interview with the actress who played Goneril, and she said, I didn't know, who understands Shakespeare? Even I don't understand Shakespeare, And I said, well, this is exactly what it felt to me in her explanation.
So just an aside, but my course that I teach on Shakespeare is called Owning Shakespeare. Very similar vibe.
Okay.
I've got questions. I've got questions for Barbara. I've got questions for Barbara on how to teach the use of cadence to convey meaning. So if you'd be able to relate those questions to her, I'd be fascinated to hear her answer. But I think we've digressed to a point now where we're slightly off the rails. So we'll try and pull it back onto this discussion for now. But once we've stopped recording, maybe we'll pick up on that thread. So
immersive
we've done
technology,
positives and negatives.
Uh,
So
yeah,
we've
and
got
immersive
key.
technology
Sorry, yes,
just
go on.
yeah, sorry, because you were saying about the line, yeah,
Linear
the
narrative. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe
So
we pick up there. So I guess the question is the role of agency in a
yes,
story that is linear. I suppose that's
yes,
the question, is
yes,
how to balance the sense that people, I have termed this audience enfranchisement, by which I mean they are invested in the world and what happens in the world affects them, so they don't feel like they're passive recipients. So one of the concepts that we have in this show is we have the two audience classes. So we have the crew class and the officer class. And the idea is that their fortunes will invert through the course of the play. So when the officers turn up, we're in the Royal Navy, they've got the best of everything. And then when the mutiny happens, the crew class are then on top, and the audience, the officer class are then the second class citizens of the two types of audience that we have. Again, original parallels, you have the yard and the gallery and the globe. We're trying to play with that, but actually take people on a journey of status where their status changes. So that's an example of how the world is going to affect them. I guess the question is, how can they be made to feel like, because again, I think it might have been an article you sent me even, but it said an experience doesn't have to be authentic for you to have an authentic experience. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. How can we make people feel like they are inputting, they are contributing to the world without them radically departing from the story that's being told, I suppose, is the challenge that we're facing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was thinking about the question of agency when you were saying about the bit of a contrast there and the crooks, because people, as I said earlier, people can be lazy, but I think there's a difference. That's why there's a crucial difference between VR and AR versus immersive theater, because I think in VR and AR, what happens is that you're not being necessarily observed by others. If you're doing some actions in a virtual world, you're not necessarily thinking about people being there in physical space watching you. Or if you're in AR and you're experiencing in your home, like for instance Nexus Tempest, first of all, nobody's observing you, or if people are observing you, they don't necessarily see what you're doing because you're just swiping or you're tapping. So it's a very different kind of action. And I think it's very important to think about what kind of actions you want from your audience members in real life, where they might feel shy, they might feel embarrassed. And I have to say, lots of the productions where I went to like Julius Caesar with the RSC, Julius Caesar, the Barbican, and at some point, people were asked to shout, like from the audience. I mean, usually it just doesn't work. People feel embarrassed. They feel like they're being pushed to do something. And some people for this reason hate immersive theater, because they feel like it's really pushing their limits, like, I don't want to be necessarily doing all those things, like, you just give it to me, you just look after me, take care of me. I don't want to act, like, I pay for the ticket, you act for me. So I think this is something really important to think about. And also coming back to your idea of enfranchising your audiences. I mean, there is this important concept by Jacques Rancière of emancipation of audience, right? And the idea that you don't have to necessarily like do stuff, just being actively engaged and self-reflexive and critical in the process of observing. Even like actors in the dark auditorium can be emancipated if they feel like they're being like in Brechtian theater, for instance, they might be given choices, they might be they treated like an intelligent member, like partner in dialogue. I think that's it can be about.
So how are the audience given those choices then in a situation where the narrative is still linear? What kind of choices are they given? Is it again that freedom to have an opinion, or is it something more than that?
I think it can be just about, I mean, the thing, I'm just trying to think, the things, I think the shows that I've worked on were not linear. I mean,
right.
Yeah, I mean, the one with Punzo, which I witnessed in Italy, was it was I don't know, it was linear. I mean, it was episodic. It was linear in the sense that there was some sort of a narrative arc. I mean, I feel like every performance will try to have some action, but it wasn't necessarily, following the story of Hamlet. It was actually Amlicha. There was the show I saw. It was a bit of like Hamlet with Alice in Wonderland. But I think, yeah, there wasn't linear. No, there wasn't linear. I think it's difficult, if you've got linear shows, particularly because you don't want your outcomes to depend on the audience behavior, because audiences are unpredictable.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have those moments where where you don't necessarily put everything, not everything depends on the audience. It doesn't hinge, the progress doesn't hinge on, because people can be just so disappointingly silent, or they might say something random, or
So an
So I
example
think,
of that
yeah.
that we're thinking of is pirate captains were elected by the crew, and every crew member got a vote. So we're going to allow the audience to vote on who gets elected
Yeah.
as captain. Macbeth and Malcolm are going to stand for election.
Yeah.
And then it's going to be eyes, nose, the eyes have it, this person wins, right? So we are asking them to vocalize, I suppose, to express an opinion. However, if they decide to troll the show and go, Malcolm should be captain, all of the cast can raise their voices in favor of Macbeth to sway the motion. And then, so there's an illusion of agency there, if you like. Does that sound like...
That sounds like a lovely idea. And also I love, because
territory.
we talked about this before, and it sounds like, as you said last time we spoke about this, that it's also suggesting this world is corrupt.
Yes. Yeah. It certainly will do if that happens. Yeah.
And because I think a fundamental question when you're doing any adaptation of Macbeth is to think about what kind of tragedy you're making. Is this a tragedy of an individual or a tragedy of the world?
Yes. So what we are doing is very much a tragedy of the world. What we're trying to focus on is inequality, intersectionality, in particular, and injustice, obviously. And the moral of the story, the thing that we want people to go home meditating on, I suppose, is that revolutionaries so often use the tools of their own oppressors to oppress the people underneath them, and that it's a betrayal of the revolution, essentially, you look at most socialist revolutions, and they've ended up using totalitarian methods to consolidate power. And that, in a sense, is what Macbeth is doing in this, because it's a mutiny. He's elected by popular vote, which does happen in Macbeth. He's elected via tanistry. It's just never talked about. There's 3 lines about it, and audience members never understand that. So we're making that really explicit. And so he is elected, but then Banquo is made the quartermaster, and quartermasters were there to limit the power of the captain, and that also is made explicit to the audience. And then he murders Banquo so that no one can limit his power. So you see him using the same kind of oppression that the Navy was using on the crew against his best mate, essentially. And that should be where you start to see the tragedy coming out. And I think ultimately what I'd like to layer underneath that is that money is the big villain, right? Because it was money that caused the Navy and the East India Company and slave traders to do what they did, to exploit the workers that they had. And it was money that caused the pirates to commit atrocities in return. And so what I want to try and thread in is this corrupting power of gold. And we're kind of going to take some bits of text from Time of Athens, hopefully, and pepper those through so that the audience gets enough of a sense that there is massive injustice in the world. That's bad. Macbeth's behavior is bad. But underneath all of that and motivating all of that is the money and the kind of the imperialist expansion, I guess. That's something that needs more development as a mental thread. But that's what I'm going towards, I guess.
Yeah. And I think, I love this analogy, and I think there is something about the fact that East India Company starts, around this time of Shakespeare's Globe, and I think it would be, important for audiences to, think about these analogies and kind of make them, because not everybody remembers and understands those concepts. So
I guess one question with that is, how much do we give the audience in advance of their arrival? How much context do we provide via email before they come, via social media, all that kind of thing, so that people that are attending the show have some kind of historical basis in which this has taken place? Because otherwise we're going to be spoon feeding the mountains of exposition in the show, which feels inelegant. So I suppose there's a question there about how do we get the audience in the right mind frame before the show begins, so that then the show can just happen and they're seeing it in the right way. There's a magicianship to it almost.
Yes. Well, I would definitely make sure that there is bits of it. I know, because I work with crew, we had so much research, and then we were just thinking, oh my God, how are we going to put it in dramaturgically into the piece? And it became lecture-like, in parts, but there was also meant to be lecture-like. And this is not something that you might necessarily want. But I think a good example of how this can be done, really good example, is a company, I think they're called Metis. Have you seen their World Factory?
No.
Oh my God, they're amazing. And I think they do audience engagement really well. They do research really well. And they do, I think they're called Metis. And this show is called Factory and World Factory, was at Young Vic. And it's an example of a really good show. This, yeah, Metis Arts, yeah. And this was a project which was so maybe I'll explain a little bit about this project. So just give you a sense of some ideas of what I think was particularly effective for audiences. Yeah. So this was a show at Young Vic. For the concept of the show was it was about China and how China is the work factory, how it's about inequality and exploitation of workers. And they wanted to show how, you know, those things have influence on us. What are the horrible working conditions? What are the choices we make as consumers, as you know, or people who own these companies? What are the entanglements? So like really big issues. And they've done a lot of research. I think they had like a shirt produced in China and they kind of followed the whole process of making it. So there was a lot of information, a lot of research, but the way they did it was incredibly effective. They basically presented some sort of like almost like a game, you know, like they put us in groups. And I think a group thing is a really interesting idea because people might feel shy or uncomfortable. And this creates a sense of like allegiance to your, you know, group. You like, you want to, you know, maybe, you know, make sure you do well with your group and maybe also breaks down the sense of people just being as a mass of audience, creates a sense of intimacy. I think another show where a group structure worked really well was Hotel Medea by a company called Zecora Uno, which South Bank, yeah, it was a whole night show, also immersive, also kind of one where you know walk around the different spaces. And in Metis, they had a figure of a guide. So there's this wonderful actress who was just, you know, she's very charismatic. She's got this wonderful presence, and she would explain like the process. She would, you know, let us know what was going on. They would feed us certain information on cards, and we were always making choices, you know. So you could choose to pay your workers, or you could just make more benefits, you know, like make more profit. And then it was all kind of like almost playing this game, but we were constantly being forced to make these choices. So I think in a way, you know, maybe like putting people in groups and forcing them to enact certain behaviors or, you know, make certain choices, you know, like, you know, maybe, you know, you said this Stanford experiment, right? You know, making people decide what they do with other group members, right? And then who, you know, and then in the end, there was the idea of who wins. And then the group had to decide collectively what will be the future. So I think Metis Arts is a really interesting company in terms of thinking about audience choices and groups. I think so. Yeah, putting people in groups, I think, is a really.
I think divide and conquer and subdivide and conquer is a really interesting insight to take out of that. Getting within a group of 20, which it might be the crew class, take 4 of those and say you're going to be tying knots in ropes, and then those ropes get used to strangle somebody, and then they feel like they're responsible for it, you know, that kind of thing. But that's something where normally I'd be like, oh, should we just get one person, because that's like how Punch Drunk do it, right? They do one-to-ones, and that's like a big part of how they work. But I like the idea of small groups actually, because it just diffuses that spotlight a little bit.
Absolutely, because people might be absolutely shy and they might be uncomfortable, you know. And also I think it enhances audience experience because maybe there'll be several people who want to be in that group, you know, and I think it creates different dynamics as well, very interesting dynamics, you know, which is I think a unique thing for groups. So coming back to this question about
agency, I think it was where we started.
Yeah, it was about, also like deploying so in a sort of linear, what role can agency play? So where did we know? Where am I here?
Yeah, so what role can agency play in a story that's linear on the rails is the question.
Yes, so I think, it can make people feel acknowledged, you know, that they're kind of important and looked after. If the performance were virtual, which is not the case here, I put down that it can create a sense of liveness. But I think it just can make people more present, not in a sense that, you know, even if it's a live performance, people might just sometimes, you know, wander off and kind of, So it kind of creates a sense of being in the moment. And in your specific piece, where you're interested in exploring questions of inequality and exploitation, this can be thematically, you know, used to think about how we are put in those positions. And I think it would be really interesting, you know, if you could put people in those, you know, have them perform different trials where they are, you know, making these ethical choices.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've got that's an opportunity area for that, I guess, is a mock trial, which is an actual thing that pirates used to do for their own entertainment on board ship. And the idea is to make the audience, or some of the audience, the jury in that mock trial, and then they decide whether the characters kind of live or die. But it's a joke, so there's no true stakes, no characters will actually die, but it's a way for them to feel like they're involved in that bit of a scene. I guess another thing is, when the mutiny happens, we're going to have the articles drawn up. Lady Macbeth's going to write the pirate code, and when you turned pirate, you had to sign your name on that document as a commitment that you were going to live by these principles. So that choice is going to be offered to everybody, so officers and crew. So people that were officer class can potentially switch, or if they decide to stay where they are, they need to be arrested in some way, right? They need to be confined in some way. So I guess the question is, could we recruit some of the audience from the crew class to actually arrest in some way, tie up in some way, restrain it in some way, the audience members that are in the officer class? And how can we teach the audience how the mechanism by which they do that in such a way that it's safe, but nevertheless that they feel like they are actively binding someone's hands, for instance, or something like that.
Well, an interesting example of actually hanging on stage with audience participation is I Malvolio by Tim Crouch.
Right, so Tim Crouch is a massive influence on my work, and his idea of, specifically his idea about theatre not being real, and the more real you make it, the worse it gets, essentially. So could you explain a bit more about I Malvolio?
Oh my God, he's really pushing the boundaries there, because I saw it at the Unicorn as a and this is a children's theatre, and I think the show was advertised for, I think, teenagers as well. And there were quite a few students in the group. And I think he was just asking an audience member to come and help him hang himself, as Malvolio. So, this is an example of really pushing it to the limits, and I think making it quite uncomfortable for the audience. And I think it's kind of important that when this happens, you have established relationship with the performer, that it's not something that, there's a complex mixture of feelings. It's not just maybe, you're not just repelled or shocked, but there is also a sense of empathy, or you just, you feel for the performer because you like them, because they've been with you on this journey. So I think it's also important about like placing this moment and making it in a way that you've already feel like you've invested something into this show.
Okay, great. So we have a plan in this, because the murderers in Macbeth just disappear and they get away with it. So in this version, they're going to be around till the end, and they're going to get hanged at the end. And the idea is that anyone that is part of the crew class will also, the implication is, so I guess blocking wise, what I would like to happen is that the officer class audience that have been through the ringer, through the middle part of the play, when Malcolm comes back, they're back on top, and I want to get them herding the crew into a spot without necessarily knowing why. And at the front of that group of the audience are going to be the two murderers who are going to be the audience's guides. So they will have had an opportunity to develop a relationship. And then at that point, they're going to get nooses put around the neck, and they're going to get hung during Malcolm's last speech, with the implication that the audience behind are next. And then obviously the show will end because we can't hang the audience. But I guess that's the question, is how far can you go with that? And do you keep going as far as the audience is willing? So like, if those guys get hung, do you have extra nooses around that those audience members are asked to place around the necks of the other audience members, for instance? And obviously, they're sewn, so you can't actually like tighten them or anything, so they're gimmick pieces. But like, do you hand them and say, right, put that round that person's neck, and only when they go no does then the show end, for instance? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it like how, I guess I'm interested in exploring how far we can push dynamics like that again give choice but don't affect the trajectory of the story. But
the hanging will be quite realistic. What will be the
no, it'll be stylized, because the masts on the ship aren't load bearing, so we couldn't actually, it wouldn't be like there's a stunt harness that they're connected to and they're actually dangling. It would just be that hopefully there'll be an elevated area that they'll be stood on, and then they'll be able to step off, and the rope will actually be too long, and then they just pull on the end of the rope, for instance. So we'd try and disguise it so it's a bit more illustrative than literal. Again, we not going for theatre of the real in that way.
I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know, because if this final hanging is shocking enough, I think that, you know, it's already like a powerful moment for people to think. And I think if
Right,
you
sure.
start haggling with people, okay, who wants the rope? Do you want a rope? No,
Yeah,
I
yeah, you got you.
that
Yeah, it just
can
kind of
really put-
diffuses, yeah, what's happening. Cool.
which kind of reminds me, what was the show that I saw? Oh, something at the Roundhouse, was a Shakespeare show. Oh, I forgot what was the title. Oh, what was it? But there was kind of like a figure hanging. It's about the twins.
Titus Andronicus.
No, the twins and the twin servants.
Comedy of Errors.
Comedy of Errors, right? Thank you. So it was Comedy of Errors, but it was not funny at all. And at the beginning, the father was hanging on a rope.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of soldiers. It was kind of really dark, and there were a lot of migrants, kind of selling fake designer goods, and running around and hiding containers. And then at some point, right before the interval, one of them got shot, and then the interval happened. And I think that was, you know, like a moment when you kind of, whoa, right? So I think it's, you know, it's nice to finish, you know, with a strong note, as opposed to having, you know, like people then, you know, being, I don't know, embarrassed and laughing maybe.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's the thing as well. You can't guarantee that people are going to stay in the world, because it's so easy for them to stay out of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Fab.
I have to come back, because there is something, the key things productions should bear in mind when trying to maximize the quality of the audience experience.
Yes, let's do that one. Yeah.
So very quickly, so I think I've got this kind of line: sophistication of the work versus simplicity of access. You know, that you want to create something that, you know, and I thought about this in terms of technology initially, but it applies also to immersive. If you want people to be able to access, it has to be simple enough so they know the rules and they are clear, and what actions are being required from them are not necessarily overbearing. And that I think the key thing, which always I think about, is that, you know, audience is not part of the process. They've not been part of the process, and we cannot assume that they will know what we as creatives know. And I think it's something to remember about. It's something, that we have to always invite them into the world, especially if it's so research rich.
Yes, yeah. And I think that I'm hoping that there's things that we can do with mise en scène with that. So like having a chart that has all of a list of different sized ships on it, and those ships have the names of the Scottish places on them, so that immediately when you go, oh, it's Captain of the Corridor, you understand that the Corridor is now a ship, and it's this size ship, whereas the one that we're about to go on is the flagship, and that's bigger. And like people get the relative importance of the different roles and statuses and things of that nature through that. I think the other thing that I'm thinking is when people arrive, obviously they'll hand over one of two tickets, an officer or crew class one, and then they'll get fed to different spaces. And then there'll be essentially a kind of drill sergeant type bit where they're taught how to follow orders. So when you're told, stand to attention, they have to do it. And then when they're told march, they have to march. These are all kind of land-based ones. There'll be naval equivalents, but it's that idea of they'll be given instructions on, we are going to move spaces now, and this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to move, we're going to stop, we're going to get in place. So, you know, if we tell them brace, for instance, that might mean you have to kneel down, something like that. And so they get given this grammar, and then they're drilled in it for 5 minutes or so, so that then when the show starts, that they, again, are not left helpless about, oh shit, where am I supposed to stand? Brace. You get to the wall.
And simple, as you say, simple and clear, and something people have, you know, practiced. I think it's always important. And I think it's and I think it's also, because we talk about the research and how to make it clear, I think it's also okay to assume that there'll be different layers of understanding and knowledge, that, you know, not everybody has to get everything. You know, you might have, like, it's, you know, make an analogy, like you might have like 100%, you know, of like what you've researched, and some people will get like 90, some people will get 80, some people get 20. But I think it's also important to create a piece where even if people get 20 because they have never read Macbeth, there might be people who have never read Macbeth, they have no clue what, you know, like East India Company was, or like what's the historical, they still will enjoy the show.
Yeah, and I think that comes from relating to the characters and being able to tell a visual story. So, you know, it's not hard to see someone having a difficulty making a decision. You can understand that if you don't understand the text. You can understand someone getting murdered if you don't understand the text. You can understand the ghost showing up, etc. So like, I think we're reasonably safe in that regard.
Yeah, which is exactly what Shakespeare did, right? I mean, he was talking to lots of people, and people maybe
exactly 100%.
They would be getting like 20%, but then people sitting there might be getting all the philosophical and mythological references. So
for sure. Listen, I know we're at time now. Do you have a little bit more time just to try and drive through a couple?
I do. Yeah. So I'll be trying to go quicker about this. Okay. So
the next one I think is when are immersive technologies best deployed in a theatrical context?
Yes. So I think when they're part of the story, so I think I've got a lot kind of to say about technology being used as a gimmick. And I think that's really a shame, because they can be used much more inventively. Yeah. And I think it's, they should not necessarily be used as just for illusions and magical effects.
Okay.
And I think there's, for instance, nice progress when you can see the RSC Tempest versus their the Dream. So the Tempest was very much a gimmicky, was let's make an opulent modern version of a mask. With all this technology, and it just felt like it was about special effects, whereas in their Dream they went for ecological eco-criticism, kind of social awareness, environmental issues, and also the idea of making audiences aware of how this performance is being made, because at the moment when they showed the motion capture in making. So I think that's a really big shift, and I think that shows that they're starting to use these technologies much more so in a much sophisticated way. So yes, so it's about making them part of the story, and also making them easy to use.
Okay, so a couple of things to unpack there. The way that we're thinking of deploying the technologies is largely for like illusions and magical effects, like that. Because this play has a lot of those, and it's just an obvious way to do it. So I suppose for me, the question is, how could you sophisticate, to use a verb slightly wrongly, that deployment, if you like? So how do you do that in a way that isn't an eye roll?
Yeah, no, I think, I think there are ways to do that. So for instance, when it's, magic, in line with the themes of Macbeth, it could be about, is it magic or is it mental health illness? Is he suffering from insomnia, or is he going crazy? So I think it could be magic, but in a way that is also questioning, whether this is really happening, and whether he's doing it for real. I think that could really open up some interesting issues. I think, now we talk all about mental health issues, especially, in pandemic, post-pandemic, whatever it is. But I think it's an important thing about, what is illusion, what is real, what is not, what am I feeling, what's my body.
That's just give me an idea. I just want to run by you philosophically. The witches in this are sirens, so they're mermaids. The idea is that scene could theoretically take place underwater. And I mean, theatre underwater, it will be on dry land, of course. But what I mean is, we could have it that the characters are essentially drowning, and then they meet the witches, and then they're pulled out of the water by Ross and Lennox, who have arrived to give Macbeth the thane of whatever. And so there's an idea that the witches are never seen outside of below the surface. And if that's the case, could we plant the seed of, are these witches real, are they not? If we keep them below that liminal space of the waterline, if you like. No, I think it's nice. And it's also the idea of, if you go down to the bottom, that's where you find the evil, that's where you find yourself. It's also like this whole metaphors, right, of immersion in the water, of coming, to the source of life, but also maybe to the source of your evil, this space that is beyond time and space. I think it's a lovely idea. Okay, cool. So that's something for us to bear in mind, is that the objective of creating that space and creating those characters is that they could exist in essentially like a Jungian collective unconscious, because obviously they speak to Banquo as well, so it can't just be in his head, someone else has heard them, so they have an objectivity there. But I think one thing that I'm keen to avoid with the witches is the idea that they're puppeteers, that everything is on the rails in the story, that the outcome is guaranteed. That's something that I'm trying to kind of get away from. So it's how much power do they wield and why? And I think the difference between, I think there's a fascinating dramaturgical difference between Banquo and Macbeth, because all Banquo needs is one more example. Because as soon as Macbeth becomes king, he's like, well, fucking hell, they're telling the truth, which means that'll set me up in hope, because my sons will be kings by the same tenor. So so it's not that he needs a lot more convincing. And I think that I'm just fascinated by what do we do with that essentially, like because if they only spoke to Macbeth, it would be simpler. If Lady Macbeth didn't do the "come you spirits who tend on mortal thoughts" and actually call creatures from the Netherrealm to inhabit her, it would be simpler. If Banquo didn't hear them, it would be simpler. So Shakespeare has complicated the objectivity of those characters. I don't think we necessarily need an answer for that. I think what we need to do is maximize the complexity of that, so the audience is scratching their head and going, but they're so clearly in his head, but then they can't be because that and the thing with the and we kind of, and I guess then it's about Banquo Macbeth and Lady Macbeth all reaching down to that to those same depths, I suppose.
Yes. I think it's about becoming almost immersed in evil, right? And as soon as you do that, you encounter certain visions.
I guess, and this is like a tangential reference, but like people that do ayahuasca apparently all kind of meet the same person, and so it's this idea of like, if you're in an altered state, there could be some sense of similarity. And then I think but maybe we do something where the costumes are tweaked, or maybe we do something where there's something slightly different about how they address each of those three, in order to mess with the audience again. The idea that they're customized to the person that they're speaking to might be a way,
like out of the world experience, right? So many people report that they're seeing this tunnel, the light.
Yes, exactly, so there's like, but again, then there's that question of how much is that planted in our brains because we've heard of other people having those experiences, and it's self-fulfilling prophecy, which again that's Macbeth is a self-fulfilling prophecy. His ambition is already there. He admits to having thought about murdering Duncan prior to the witches telling him that he's going to be king. So like that all that stuff is in there. I guess the challenge for us is how we make that clear through the storytelling. Cool. And using creative technologies to do so, obviously. So I guess it'd be great if you could give me a couple of examples, if you know of any, where other than the RSC dream, because not being funny, but I had my problems with that. That to me felt very gimmicky. Where in a theatre, so not a purely virtual experience, do you feel like immersive technologies have been well deployed?
Okay, I'm thinking. I think there was so I think there was a right before lockdown, like a few days before lockdown, there was this thing at the Battersea Arts Centre, which was by Dream Think Speak.
By who? Sorry.
Dream Think Speak.
Dream Think Speak. Okay.
You know them?
No.
They do a lot of immersive work. Actually,
Nice.
They're really really interesting, and it's called Dream Think Speak, one word.
Right.
And there was a show which was part of Future Cities kind of program at the back, and the idea was that they were taking us on a journey, and we were exploring different spaces. And I think what was very effective about this experience is, I think when this is a hybrid experience, when you create a link or a moment of transition between life and the virtual moment. And when you unsettle people's, expectations, like you were thinking that there was a door somewhere, but then they led you through it. When they disorient you, I think it shouldn't be about making people cozy and giving them illusion of something. I think it should be about them starting to question, like, whose body is it? Where am I? What's going on? And I think, and also, I think what's really interesting is when you are able through this technology to kind of enter the enhanced state of empathy. With crew, we've explored a lot the idea of what happens if you're put into someone else's head, and to what extent VR, for instance, can enable empathy. And I think one of the most amazing projects I've seen with VR has been, I haven't seen it. I've seen some bits of it, and then but I only know the whole performance, is Cruz Terra Nova. I'm going to send you a link to. They have a nice YouTube trailer, which is really nice.
Right.
And this is a show where, I mean, the problem with VR is that you can't have many audience members experiencing it at the same time, right? So they kind of had people watching what other people were being immersed, and they really played with the idea of VR as a way. It was about the experience of the Arctic and the exploration that ended badly, but the idea was also that with VR we're also exploring a different world, and we're trying to enter different kind of extreme parts of our experience and endurance. It was a really wonderful show. I'm just going to send you a link.
Yeah, please, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, it's just it's a short clip. I'm just so I think, is this the one? Just one is not. Yeah, this is one. So I'll send it so maybe you can watch it, like in.
Yeah, no, that'd be brilliant. That'd be brilliant. Thank you. I've got their website up as well, the Dream Think Speak one. So I've got a kind of sense of
it was a short. I don't think they went, like I think Cruz Terra Nova is really like the best, example. Because they really, are interested in those moments of unsettling the illusion and making connections, philosophical connections between our senses and our experience of the world and social aspects of very social issues. It's quite complex, but multi-layered what they do.
Fabulous. Great. Okay, cool. So I feel like we've touched on setting audience expectations and behaviors a little bit already. It's essentially just do it and make it really clear and make it really simple. Simple instructions, easy to follow. And I think just having that grammar of these are the moves that you're going to get taught and they're going to apply in every space that we go to, and there's 5 moves, then you know that when you hear the command that needs that move, you go and do it, and then it sorts itself out, kind of thing. And then strategies of companies use to create audience-focused theatrical experiences. So I'm struggling to remember exactly what I meant by that now, but I think the point is that for me, like the RSC Dream was not audience focused. There was no role for the audience, and there was no so like the agency that you were given was the false agency where you move a dot and you don't know whether the other dots are other people and all that kind of thing. And ultimately it's arbitrary because you're just going to a different point in the forest, but the story carry. And so like for me, it kind of tripped up my brain. And so I guess the question is, maybe it's not audience focused, maybe it's putting the focus on the audience. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it.
No, I agree that, for me, the dream wasn't about me being active as an audience member, but I didn't crave that at that point. I just wanted, I craved other people's company. For me, it was more about sociability, and I liked that it was contained in time, and I felt like there were other people responding, and I didn't have to do anything. So it was, I wouldn't use an example. It was a performance for me, which was in a very particular time where like we couldn't see theater, where I could actually see theater. And I could sit down and relax, that's what I enjoyed it. So I think strategy. So I think, yes, having a guide is absolutely, crucial. We talked about this. Interactivity that is not something, and I was thinking about VR and AR, where it's something you do and it's not embarrassing, it's not necessarily very demanding. But I think if you have interactivity in immersive, I don't think in immersive, which is live, you necessarily have to have a lot of interactivity, and it has to be important. I think, people might just, because in VR and AR, it's a different story, because people might not know that the actors are there. They might not know that the actors know that they're there. So I
think that's an interesting one as far as Shakespeare is concerned, because you have private scenes and public scenes. And so I think what we can really easily do is just make a rule, which is no interactivity stuff in private scenes. So when you're not supposed to be there, you're not suddenly then pulled out of that and asked to get involved in something. Whereas when there is a role for the audience to play, in a scene with a lot of characters in it that's in a wide open space, then that's an opportunity area, I suppose. So I guess there's a prefixed grammar that we can use to kind of streamline that somewhat.
I'm sorry that Hotel Medea is no longer online, but it was a wonderful, because they had lots of clips on YouTube, and this company is called Zecora Uno. I think now it's Zecora UK, because they're now based in London. I mean, they're Brazilian British. They're really interesting company, and they have lots of examples of interactivity. But I think So in Hotel Medea, for instance, we were at the wedding of Medea, so we were, guests dancing at the party. There was a scene where we were given hot chocolate and put to bed. We were all lying in beds. We had to hide because Medea wanted to kill us. We were put in different roles. And that's also interesting where you're given different roles within a single show. But I think, ultimately these were not onerous in a sense that, like we were not singled out necessarily. We were always part of the group. And it didn't feel like you were, because I think for some people it might just feel like they're being exposed and they have to like exhibit themselves in front of other people, and they might not want to do certain things that are so, in demanding. So I think it's something to bear in mind. So having a guide, yes, interactivity, but to extent, and I think sociability, and I think that sense of like being with others, which is already part of a live performance, which it can be even enhanced by having people put into groups, I think is really valuable.
I think with sociability, I think there's an accessibility thing there as well around relaxed performances, and the fact that actually allowing the audience permission to speak as long as they're not being super disruptive, I think can actually be a benefit to the atmosphere of a show, because it's one of the key ways in which people choose to engage with the work, right? I went to see Romeo and Juliet at the Globe with a friend of mine called Gabriel Acamo, and he was just it was like he was at the cinema. Like something would happen and he'd go, "Oh!" and he just like massive vocal reactions, and he was like so in it. And like I think Mercutio said something funny and he was like, "Get it!" and he was just like, like he was just like engaged in it to the point where, and I think it's because he's a spoken word poet, that kind of thing, there's space for that to happen at spoken word gigs, where if someone drops lines that someone really responds to, you're allowed to like react audibly. And I think in Kabuki as well, they when an actor does something really well, they'll shout the name of the actor in the auditorium like really loudly, and it tends to be the family names. It's family names, so it's very legacy based. But nevertheless, there's space for you to vocally approve of or disapprove of what's going on the stage, and I think that's something is just such a simple thing but really important.
And I think the Globe is a really good example, because in the Globe you just don't go to see the actors, you go to see the audience as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really nice reminder.
And even when I go to like traditional theater performances, I always look at the audience. Yeah,
that's really nice. Right, virtual or live streaming experiences that audiences have responded to most positively, and what were the approaches that connected them?
Yeah, I think I recently read about Santa Claus Tempest, which I have not seen myself personally, but I read other people's feedback, and it seemed like people really enjoy the interaction, but this is virtual, and that I think so I think with live streaming, from what I understand, people enjoy this kind of like Twitter and being able to socially engage. So I think with virtual and live streaming, people want to have some sort of like be able even to have some impact on the work, or feel that others are having impact, so that there is a social experience. So for instance, for me in the RSC Dream, what I really liked was the fact that people were live in the studio and they were asking questions, they were answering them live, and that there was a limited time span in which it was happening in place, and it was kind of live. So I like that.
But it's interesting because when we did TSMGO, the first thing that we put in was a Q&A to prove that it was live, and it was really funny that the RSC ended up doing the same thing. It was like, just in case you had any doubts, we are actually in the room doing it now.
And you can ask questions, which you don't have to do, which I didn't ask questions, but the other people did, and it was great.
Nice. Nice, fabulous. And then examples where the audience has been split along class lines and pitted against each other.
Class lines, because I always wonder, okay, so first of all, what I put is like, I feel that class lines are always there in theater, right? Unless it's a show where the tickets are in the same price, but rarely so in the UK. I mean, it's very interesting. I think, I mean, when I go to theater in my hometown, the tickets cost the same, whether you sit where it doesn't matter where you sit. Whereas here it's always based on like prices, and it's just very interesting for me. And I think it's always there, like especially in opera, right? Whether you sit in the stalls, whether you sit in the gods, I mean, it's just there. And I feel like yeah, it's very much in the seating. But in terms of, you know, people being, you know, explicitly identified with certain classes and pitting pitted against each other, I've not encountered any of this. And I also wonder in terms of, you know, class. I mean, what class do people identify with, you know?
Well, it's what class they identify with in the show. So it's not their own innate class. So
Oh, right. Okay.
somebody
Yeah,
that's working class can buy a ticket to be an officer. And then they're
yeah,
officer class,
okay,
and then they're treated as if they're privileged. So, I mean, one thing that you've said there right away is about proximity to the playing space, or actually who gets to stand at the front and who gets pushed back. Like those are dynamics that we can really play with, because that's something that our audience is already trained to understand. So I think that's a really clever notion of where we put the audience at different points in the story.
Something else as well, you know, there are some benefits. So for instance, if you remember, there was, I think was it Network, I think at the National, I don't know, maybe it was Network.
Oh, they had a bar on the stage?
No, when people were eating, when people were having dinner on the stage.
Right.
No, it was not just a bar, you know, like some people, but no, it was, I don't think it was a Network. I think it was some other show. And anyway, people could buy tickets to have a 3-course meal and be very close to the stage. And obviously, like, you know, just sitting there, and some blokes are having like meal, you know, like very nice meal, and they're very close to the stage. So, you know, maybe there could be, you know, some other perks, you know, that
like they can get a glass of something on arrival or something of that nature.
And that immediately sets people off, you know, like
well I mean, I don't know what the health and safety, and also just the affordability budget wise, because obviously food is consumables, so you have to have fresh every day. You can't, it's not like props where you can use the same prop for the whole show.
But so even a glass of water in a plastic, you know, like even it doesn't have to be food. Plus, you know, food is difficult because you are in a historical space. So, you know, but I wonder, like, you know, having a glass of water, you know, when it's a glass of water, you know, like you can, you know, in a plastic, like maybe the plastic, because obviously we're, you know, but anyway.
I think there's maybe something that we can do there, just to really storytell the division. And then what is it that is attracting audience? Right, so this is actually a more complex question than the one that I wrote down, but it's what is it attracting audiences to non-traditional work? I have a bit of cynicism around this, because somebody has like said, oh, theatre, you know, audiences in theatre are declining 10% year on year, it's dying out, whereas audiences for immersive stuff, it's like a really boom, it's like a growth industry. And I'm like, yeah, but that's from theatre, which is this scale, to immersive, which is this scale. So 100% growth in immersive still makes it 1/100th as big as theatre is, even as it's declining. So I think for me, there's still a relative thing about audiences. And what I'm interested in is how we can bridge the gap of trad audiences coming to see something that's a bit out of their comfort zone, and then those kind of people that love new experiences and new things, obviously still being excited to come and see this.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think very many people have never seen anything virtual, you know, whereas many people have seen a theater play. So, you know, there we are.
Yeah.
But I think there is something about, you know, theater as a social experience and the possibility of being in the center of the action. And there's also something about the hype of certain things, you know, and how you market it. I think a lot has to do with how you present what people are going to be able to do.
Sure. And so who has successfully hyped a show?
Well, Drunk is super successfully hyped. I mean, this is I think an example of a company that's incredibly successful globally, because they have shows in New York and Shanghai and London, and as soon as they claim incredibly high prices for the tickets. I mean, I just saw that they're, I don't know, up to £60 where like per ticket, they are sold out already, and the next one is like 100, and they have VIP tickets.
Yeah,
you know,
it's nuts. So what are the ingredients of the Punch Drunk hype machine? What are they doing that is working?
I think what they're doing, I mean, I've not really, you know, extensively researched Punch Drunk. I'm, you know, I'm one of the people who have seen their work, you know, as a regular audience member. Yeah. I think what they do is they create a sense of like special occasion and kind of like a story behind it. So for instance, if they do, so there's like a secrecy, you know, like we'll announce this show at some point, and like, you know, and it's like a secret location, or like there's aspect of the show that we'll only disclose later. when they were doing the show in New York, they said it was a McKintrick hotel, but in fact it was, I think it was an old factory or warehouse, but they kind of presented it was like, they gave a story to that venue as well, so it's also maybe about, in your case, you have a wonderful story you can maybe tell about this venue. I know that, I think there was a show by the company called Architects, and they were doing a show in an old chocolate factory in Bermondsey, so they also kind of, exploited the history, the hauntology of the venue. So I think these are opportunities one could take in terms of making the space exciting, creating certain interest. And then I think, making it, I think some of these companies make it about social events, but that's what the aspect of Punch Drunk's work, which I don't really appreciate, like you just go and get drunk in the bar, that's maybe not my idea.
Yeah, secret cinema as well. It's like, we have 17 bars. And it's like, cool, great. So exactly. Does any street, but sure. But nevertheless, it does work for some reason. So I think certainly something like if we can get a signature cocktail or something of that nature that we kind of... just, I guess, signals to the audience there will be an opportunity to socialize at this thing as well, if that's an important marker. Nice. So final question then, how have companies successfully diversified their audiences or attracted new audiences?
I'll be very honest, this is a really difficult question. I think, I think it will be a very important question, and I love this question, but I really don't know. And I don't know if there's enough knowledge about this, but it's an excellent question. I think, part of it might be about, ticket prices, of course, and having different bands of tickets. So I know that Young Vic and Old Vic, they usually have a certain number of tickets that are at reduced prices. I think it's also about marketing, who you reach and where you advertise your shows. And how you advertise them as well, because I think if there is maybe a lot, Shakespeare sells, that's true, but I think it also has to be, Shakespeare in a way that people don't feel like they have to have read the play, yesterday.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Shakespeare sells to a specific demo, but I think Shakespeare can put off people that are not part of that.
The other thing, exactly, So it's maybe, so maybe it's about, making it. And I think maybe you can look at Punch Drunk and look what they do, and maybe have a look at like their website.
What I think is interesting straight away about Sleep No More is obviously they don't use much, if any, of the text. They've used a line from Macbeth that cues the people who know that it is Macbeth based, but they don't call it Macbeth, so it doesn't put off people who aren't into Shakespeare. So I think there's something elegant about that, and I wonder whether with ours, if we focus more on the pirate side of it, then that will draw in a broader demo.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant idea. So, and then there could be something, I don't know, in the quote or in the description, where if people are interested in Shakespeare, they can still come and see it, but they don't have to be. It doesn't have to be the main pull.
So I think actually decentering the Shakespeare will actually get more people through the door to then watch some Shakespeare.
I agree. And also now, especially, there might be question of why Shakespeare is like a broader debate, because
I know I'm embroiled in it because I've invested like 12 years of my career in specialism, and now it's like, oh, that thing you specialized in, we shouldn't do it anymore. And it's like, oh right, okay, cool.
So I think what your show is doing in an interesting way is also about asking very big questions about imperialism, which are questions about, Shakespeare's culture.
But I think that's why, for me, Shakespeare is a tool through which to examine that stuff, because it is the shared route that much of certainly the British colonial countries, and former colonial countries, so America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. All of them share a root in that period of history, and so if we're going to examine that period of history and explore some of the things that went on there, using Shakespeare to do so, I think is a useful mechanism, I guess.
And it's not on these Anglophone countries, but it's also India, for instance, where Shakespeare has been so important part of their politics for such a long time. Another example, like, Sleep No More, you mentioned the titles, The Rest is Silence, Dream Things Speak. They did a show which was based on Hamlet, of course, and they called it, I think, The Rest is Silence. So I think, there are some some analogies there. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, do we rename? Do we retitle the show?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is really interesting. So I know even the Globe have done that, and they called Henry IV Part 1 Hotspur and stuff like that. You know, they're just trying to shake the cobwebs off it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, I must shoot off. Obviously, we're half an hour over, so thank you so much for being so generous with your time and answering all these questions in such detail. This has been such a nourishing conversation and some really exciting ideas coming out of it. Obviously, I want to continue this discussion. What I will do is, am I right in thinking that you're occupied tomorrow? That's correct, right?
Yes, I'm teaching tomorrow, Friday.
Yeah, teaching tomorrow. So what we'll do is I'll invite you to the Miro board, which is our online collaborative workshopping tool that we're using to develop ideas to create richness in the show. And one of the So essentially what we've done is we've broken down every scene and every transition in the play. And then we've got a summary of it, some of the provocations the questions that I'm mulling over. And then under that, we've got touch points of audience, performance, AV, music and sound, things like that, where people can put down ideas of how the story can be told. Using those different elements, and so I'll share it after we've done the session tomorrow with you, so that you can see where we're up to. And it would be wonderful if you'd be willing. I'll send you a working copy of our script that we're working on as well, working with, so you can see how it differs already from the kind of traditional Macbeth. And then it'd be great to get your thoughts on opportunity areas for audience in particular. That'd be a really cool focus area. Amazing. All right, I'm going to stop recording.